Everyone, and welcome to our fabulous day of POSIT presentations. I think you're all kind of familiar with what the POSIT is, so I don't have to explain it. I was prepared to go into that. But yeah, we've have been busy working on various areas of the SED research program, and we'll listen to 4 presentations today. The first 2 are from the FIXIT data set, so that's computer science success and what predicts computer science success. Then we go on to the UPSI data set, which is an older data set but still keeps on giving. And then we go to something very different, which is an experimental study. So it's a very kind of varied program, which should be exciting. The first one up is Chen, very familiar to our department for several years. As you will remember, Chen came to us to work with Matt Schneps early on dyslexia research. Then he became a research assistant with our projects, and as soon as he graduated with a doctorate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, we hired him as a postdoc, and he's been working on various projects, the MOOC project, the IRT analysis, and this is one aspect of what Chen has been working on. So please.
Thank you for coming. So today I'm going to present a paper we just submitted, is waiting to hear back from the reviewers about the effect of first programming language on college students' achievement in CS1, so that's the intro to computer science, a comparison between graphical and textual language. I think have presented in different occasions a part of the study, but today I think this is the first time I present the complete picture. So this work is in collaboration with Paulina, Karen, both from School of Education, and Githar in the field here. So in short, the question we want to ask is, what should we teach first? Should it be very technical language such as Java and Python, or should we teach some user-friendlier and especially young kids-friendlier programming language such as Scratch and Alice, right? And well, there's been so-called language wars that's been raging for as long as computer science has ever been taught, with little in the way of consensus emerging and with potentially detrimental effects. It's a hard question to ask because we will see a lot of the reasons. We'll cover it, but mainly because we just don't have so much kids. It's hard for us to follow so many kids that have learned alternative such as graphical language from young age to college. Well, just give, in case you not following what is Scratch. Scratch is this kind of graphical language that you basically just drag different components to make it a sequel, and there are a little bit programming can make. For example, you can ask the say component is dragged by the user, but you can type here what you want it to say, right? Here is to use Java to do exactly the same thing. So we can say here is more technical, more professional look like, and this one is more like picture based. So there is literature, that promote graphical, the literature that promotes a textual-based language. I think most people worry about graphical language is that the transfer process. Can I transfer from Scratch later when I go to college to Python and to Java? Or should I just learn Java first and maybe it's much easier to transfer from Java to Python, right? for that reason, a lot of people are skeptical about graphical language. So naturally, our question is, how does academic success, actually the long-term academic success in intro computer science, vary by first programming language that they have learned before college? A comparison between graphical and textual language. So the outcome of the first question was academic success in terms of computer science grade. And our second question is a comparison about students' attitudes towards computer science between graphical and textual language. Right. And the data came from the Fixit. I think most of you are very familiar with. There's like more than 10,000 students from 100-ish college institutions. We have so much guys than female students. So the structure of the data set is by the start of the semester, students who enrolled in this CS1 class have to answer a long questionnaire, and this questionnaire asks them to recall their earlier experience, if they have learned anything, their high school background, their previous SAT scores, such as those, and they also report their current attitudes towards computer science, how positive they feel about computer science, how nervous they are. And then that's all the students need to do. They submit the questionnaire, and by the end of the semester, their professors will fill in their grade of the class. So in this way, it's a convenient way for us to know their previous experience, their current attitudes, and their future grade, right? There are about 40-ish% that have never learned any computer programming at all. We call them the control group. There are 50-ish that learn textual-based programming language such as Java, Python. There are only 5% that learn graphical. It seems very small, but consider we have a large sample, we're still able to get about 400 participants in such a group, right? So to understand, to estimate the treatment effect is difficult because typically people are just satisfied with, okay, this is a correlation, or this is association. But if you want to be more rigorous, you want to partial out the bias from confounding factors. That is when it gets tricky. Most people worry about confounding factors because there is another variable here, such as access to computer, that predict both their treatment and their outcome. This is a classic scenario where you can never draw any causal inference because there is something out there that is explanatory to both your treatment and your outcome. But this is the logic behind it. But there is another more empirical reason behind it. That the C's are the control group and T's are the treatment group, right? When the control group and treatment group are not well overlapping with each other, in this case, that there's a lot of control group in this end, a lot of control group in this end, but most treatment group is in the middle. Just regression won't solve anything because actually regression will give you the wrong answer because the tail are being highly influenced by the extreme values concentrated by one of the group. You can either use non-linear regression, or you can use linear regression. You see, using a non-linear regression, you would thought that the control group did better, and if you use a linear regression, you would thought the treatment group did better. But actually, if you just parse this non-overlapping part out, you won't see a treatment effect at all. right? So this is this empirical reason why regression won't solve the problem, especially in our case that the overlapping is so small. The graphical group is tiny. They are extreme. They are strange for all kinds of reasons, right? Therefore, one approach to this is to use a matching method that we basically cut the relationship between access to the treatment in a way that is so balanced that half of them have access to and half of them don't have access to, for example, for both groups. That we know by knowing their access computer, we can predict if they go either of the group, right? That requires some technical matching and selection and trimming of the sample, right? So first, let's look at. I think what I'm most interested in is their final grade, right? Very practical. This is how the sample was balanced between the graphic group and the control group before matching, right? Before matching, we can see that their grade. This is a zero line, meaning the two groups have zero difference. And if it goes this way, it means the graphic group has higher value. If it goes this way, it means the control group has higher value. So we can see before matching, we already know that graphic group has a higher grade, right? This just to look at their raw numbers. But we also know that graphic groups more likely to have access computer, and they have their mom and dad with higher education, and their parents are more likely to encourage them to learn math. Same time, they are less likely to go to public school. So that's one of the reasons to show you that it's really unfair to compare the grade just by their raw score. So one of the matching methods we choose is nearest matching. It's basically to look at the participants whose covariates on this list are closest to each other, and we trim those who are not close at all. Like there are like a lot of people who just can't match them. We just tease them out, right? After that, we see it's pretty successful that the distance between the two groups in terms of all these covariates shrunk dramatically to near zero, whereas the grade on the very top row still remains. So that's a way to show, okay, this difference is really robust, right? And but there are many different approaches to matching. Nearest matching is a classical one. People in the matching literature always argue that why do you choose one matching over another, and if there is any fishing involved in selecting the most desirable result. So this is not a robust check. We just did a lot of matching, right? And basically we see different matchings typically have a consensus in reducing the difference in their covariates values, but they almost all agree that okay, here is a treatment effect, and is around a 0.15 standard deviation, right? And this is our regression table. First row is comparison between graphic and control. We see a significant positive treatment effect. Second is textual and control, means those who learned Java earlier. And we also see a significant positive effect. But when we look at graphic or textual, we do not see a significant effect. Meaning just by comparing them directly, we don't see that graphical and textual is better than one another. However, when we including their introduction age, we see an interesting interaction effect. And to graphic this interaction effect, we see this. This is, I think, the most interesting results by far, is that okay, the green line is the graphic group, and the red line is the textual group, right? that means there is an interaction with treatment, type of treatment, and your intro age. If you're introduced to graphical language earlier, you just have a better chance to have a higher grade than those who learn textual, like Java. But as you move to later adolescence, there's no such effect. So I think it's a pretty clear picture of the interaction effect. And then I will briefly talk about the attitudes. I think we have covered it earlier. So it's a questionnaire of how positive or how comfortable you feel about computer science. And then we still find a treatment effect. The graphical group have more positive, and as well as textual group, they also have a positive attitudes compared to the control group, right? But the two group doesn't differ as well, and there's no such interaction effect, right? So a brief recap that the experience with programming language before college associated with higher computer science grades, associated with positive attitudes, and moreover, graphical language is preferable for children with young age, right? But I think the time is but basically when we think about comparing between graphical and textual languages, this result shows that okay, it's really positive, but there's a lot more things to be answered in terms of how do we make use of the graphical language, right? Because with different format of the programming tools, we have new possibilities of what are the new possibilities, how are they explored, and especially how do teachers and students interact with each other using the new tools, and how that revolutionize teachers' pedagogy. Thank you for Dr. Brian, Phil, and Gerhard, and Willa is the student who painted all these graphs by hand. So it was pretty impressive. That's what I have. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions before we move on to the next slide.
I just have a quick question. It used to be the case, I don't know if it's still the case, that in the first year of college you could substitute a computer language for a foreign language. Is that, do we have any data on that? And would that affect, would you have to take that into account in terms of attitudes towards, I'm just wondering why are the people who take computer science committed to a career in computer science or STEM? Or is it just they're trying it out and they didn't want to take whatever German, Latin?
I think this course is a very basic intro to computer science. So they are not entered to the stage that they want committed because it's very, very basic. And we do not know those who, I think the constraint of this method is that we don't know who those did not take this course. We only know those who have shown interest in computer science.
I know you had a small sample that was actually exposed to graphical computing language. Any gender differences? Because you also had a small gender sample.
Right.
So
right.
I don't know that I saw that.
I can't remember. There's it's a long table. I trimmed it, so I forgot. I think, but I don't want to give the wrong stereotype. But I think that did girls perform better than boys?
I don't remember.
I will get it back to you.
Yeah.
It's very easy to check.
Right.
But I reported in the paper, but because it's we compare many stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
How maybe we can see from here of gender. Yeah. So here is I forgot how gender was coded.
Yeah.
But before matching, gender was very unbalanced, meaning
Females had more exposure to graphical. Is that what that's saying?
No, not necessarily.
It's not.
Not necessarily.
No.
I
You
can't-
can, depending on which way it's
whoever
coded.
whoever is
Right,
gender is
we
one.
don't know.
Yeah,
Right.
but we only know it's very imbalanced. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I can get it back to you.
So did
Yeah.
the graphical group learn any textual languages as they got older?
Probably we don't know. Okay, this is on comparison of which programming they learned first. But we do not know if they transit to another programming language or not, or how many they transit to. But it's possible that those who learn Scratch transit to Java as senior
it
year in
looks
high
from your
school.
graph, if they
Yeah,
switch when they're 14, they can
Right.
do better.
right. Yeah.
The survey didn't capture which languages they were exposed to prior to the CS101?
It captured a bit of it, but we just don't know exactly when they did it and how much they did it. It's just so disorganized. We feel, it's not ready to answer that
And
question.
when you did the optimum match, what did that do to your end number for your
Uh,
final result?
For the final result,
Especially given that you had a small sample
the
for the graph.
different matching methods will trim the number differently. Some are more relaxed, that they trim less. For example, there was 1,000, like before matching, there's 1,000 textual, like 4,000 textual and 400 graphical. Relaxed approach, you will end up with about 1,000 or 2,000 textual. Compared to this still 400. Basically, the 400 graphics are untouched because they're easy to match.
Okay.
Like they are somewhere in the center, and because there are a lot of surplus in the other group. So, but the most extreme matching will have a 1-to-1 matching that will end up 400 graphical, 400 textual, and 400 control. Yeah, but the graphical is untouched.
Okay.
Okay, I think it's time to move on. Let's thank Chen again. We'll stay with the fix-it theme. Again, another talk about computer science. And this time, we have another POSIT member, Iva Markievich. And if you could help him put the mic up. I will give a short introduction. Eva also came to us from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She's a master's student, master candidate there in the, what's it called? Technology, Innovation, and Education program. And Eva has a Bachelor of Arts in Adolescence Education in English with a minor in Spanish from the State University of New York. And with us, she was very interested in gender differences in computer science, and I'll pull it up for you. Okay.
Hi, so like Gerhard said, my name's Eva. I use the FIXIT data to study the relationships between gender, perceived teacher competence, and computer science attitudes. I'd like to start the talk with a quote from Mi-Sean Wang, who said, 100 years ago, people were faced with the choice of learning to read or remaining illiterate laborers who would be left behind as have-nots in a rapidly modernizing world. In the coming century, being able to command the world that will be thoroughly computerized will set apart those who can live successfully in the future from those who will be utterly left behind. So what does women's participation in this current context look like? Currently, job growth in computing fields is at 13%, which is much faster than average compared to other career fields. When this is added to continually decreasing percentages of women earning computing degrees, this points to future economic shortages in a steadily growing field. A popular framework for addressing this underrepresentation has been the role model effect, which goes off of the idea that if I see someone who looks like me in a field, I'm more likely to want to pursue that field as well. So the role model effect in the context of formulating the research question matches with gender matching. So the question of does gender match teacher-student relationships mean more effective and more positive computer science attitudes for young women? And a few of the texts from the Lit Review that I've highlighted here give some varying suggestions of how this question could be answered. So in the far right square, you have the first article, Growing the Roots of STEM Majors. And this studied whether the proportion of female math and science teachers in high school impacted female students' interest in computer science and likelihood of these students declaring a STEM major. And from their study, they found that there was a positive impact on the female students and there was no impact on the male students. The next article, Sex and Science, looked at this same question within the college context and found that female students who took introductory math and science courses with female professors reported higher interest and a greater likelihood of pursuing a STEM career. Again, male students were not negatively impacted by having non-gender matched professors. In the bottom right, you have the next article, Superstars Like Me. So here they raise a new point with the idea that gender is not necessarily enough to invoke the role model effect. And for them, they actually introduce students to different role models based on measures of similarity and competence. And while they found that these were all female students and female role models, and while they found that the competence always impacted a more positive view of the introduced role model, the female students who were introduced to a role model who was more similar to them on measures such as what town are you from, what do you do for fun, better related to computer science than the students who were exposed to role models who were highly competent but who were much different from the students. And then the last sample article pulled raises a question of retention versus recruitment. And while they found that in retention, female role models may be more influential, in recruitment, there's not really a difference. So male role models and female role models can be just as effective in recruiting women into STEM because the main focus before somebody develops a STEM identity is the fear of not having a sense of belonging in the community or not being able to have quality relationships within this career field. So then, within the Lit Review, the gaps that came up was, the first one is, where are the high schools? Most of the articles I read were focused on colleges and workplaces and were focused on college professors and professionals rather than high schools and high school teachers. Other gaps included a focus on STEM overall, or math and science, rather than computer science specifically. And that perceived competence of teachers, so how students viewed their teachers as presenters of computer science material, were rarely included within their literature. From this, two research questions emerged. The first one, are students more likely to have positive views of computer science if they had at least one high school computer science teacher of the same gender? And the second one, what role does perceived competence of the teacher play in the students' computer science attitudes? So this next section gives a roadmap for how a plan for answering these questions was developed. So I used the FIXIT data, which has a total sample size of 10,197. But after cleaning the data to just include the students who have had prior computer science course experience in high school, students who were not, so taking out students who were homeschooled, taking out students who did not attend an American high school, either here or abroad. The sample size is divided into the gender pairs, so female student, female teacher, female student, male teacher, and so on, are as such. And the two main questions from the survey that I used were question 36. So this was the dependent variable on computer science attitudes of the students. And question 34, the perceived competence of the teachers as reported by students. Then control variables that were accounted for included race, ethnicity, parents' education, highest level achieved, access to computer at home, parents' careers if they were in computer science, as well as students reported SAT and or ACT math scores. To measure the data, I'm going to be using 3 methods. So first, factor analysis to build the composite for computer science attitudes, as well as for the perceived competence of teachers. The main effect of interaction between student gender and teacher gender on computer science attitudes, as well as the main effect of students' perceived competence of their teachers on their attitudes. And finally, regression analysis to measure relationships between 1, computer science attitudes and gender matching, and 2, computer science attitudes and perceived competence. So currently, I'm in the process of starting the inferential analysis. I've just completed the descriptive analysis. So I'm going to highlight some of what the descriptive analysis has shown. This first table includes the means of the CS attitudes of students. So you have the female student, female teacher, female student, male teacher, male student, female teacher, and male student, male teacher. And here you see that for the most part, the mean suggests that the male students had higher scores in computer science attitudes than their female counterparts. And most of them actually ended up being in the male students who had male teachers. As for teacher competence, the initial finding is that male teachers with female students were given the highest ratings out of all other teachers with their other students. So now, the questions that are going, So now in differential statistics, the focus is on, is there a relationship between gender matching, perceived competence, and computer science attitudes? And this will give 1 of 4 results. First one is that there's a relationship between all 3. The second one is that there's a relationship between gender matching and attitudes, but not perceived competence, or that there's a relationship between perceived competence and attitudes, but not gender matching, or there may be no connection within any of them. So the limitations in doing this research include that 1, there is no way of knowing how close of a relationship the students have had to their computer science teachers. So you have the how do you perceive your teacher, but if you were very close to your computer science teacher, you're likely to have given them a higher rating, regardless of how effective they may actually have been. Additionally, there's no definite measure of the students' attitudes towards computer science before high school, so we have information on how early they were exposed and languages they were exposed to, but there's no definite measure of how much they were interested in computer science before they met this gender match teacher. And finally, the impact of factors outside of school. So how do students' relationships with friends, family, social norms impact their attitudes? And is the relationship with that gender match teacher enough to counteract these measures? Okay, so what? Why is this question important? So like I mentioned at the beginning, careers in computer science are growing at a rapid rate, and women's participation in computer science is not growing proportionally. So there's a need to recruit more women into computer science. If the results show a positive impact between gender-matched students and teachers in high school, then one implication could be that there should be greater recruitment of female high school computer science teachers to pull in more girls and keep them, get them interested, motivated. However, if there is not an impact found in this data, possible implications are addressed by the following questions. How does this reflect on the role model effect, and does it weaken the role model effect's validity? Do high school students even see their teachers as role models? Who do high school students see as role models? and how can this be leveraged? And finally, what are the further research should be done, and what are the factors that invite female students into computer science if it's not same gender role models? And how can these influences be leveraged to get more girls into this field? Thank you for your time.
All right, thank you. And questions for Eva, please?
So how soon will we know the rest?
So I'm in the process of learning R and learning differential statistics to measure. So
Good for you for doing it.
hopefully in the next few months.
Awesome.
If we go back, could we go back to your table of data?
Yeah.
So the first one is the student, the second one is the teacher?
Oh no, these are based on, so it's, all of these are the students' attitudes, but they're broken up into, did the student have a female, or is it a female student with a female teacher, a female student with a
So
male?
FM is female
Yes.
student,
Yeah.
male teacher.
Yes.
Okay. So, so just scanning down this list with lots of significant figures, it looks like most of the categories, oh, the second one would be reverse coded, but
Yeah.
most of the categories, females with male teachers rate these things higher than females with female teachers. Yeah.
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 And it's also,
There
you
is
have
some difference in the confidence one.
Yeah.
So this is, it's a question of whether you look at, where you combine these all in factor analysis, or you look at them separately, I guess.
It's also interesting because it's the female students with male teachers had the higher attitudes, and they also ranked their teachers much higher than any other student with other teachers.
I see. I see. This is, yeah. This is interesting.
Didn't you find that in the study of physics classes, where male teachers were rated higher even by female students, regardless of their performance?
Is there any information about like schools with after-school activities that are related to computer science or anything that might be in any way related that you can kind of like supplement this stuff with? Is that maybe interesting?
That's not in the fix-it data, right? That's the...
Yeah. Well, we know what they did in terms of learning how to program. That was like the first paper to some extent, but this is not, the Fix-It survey is not focused on out-of-school activities, so we have very little information on that.
Although we do have a survey going on now that is examining just that
Yeah.
question.
Plus, there's an RFP, there's a call for proposals due this July to look at computer science research, and we're thinking about what the next steps might be for that.
Well, there are no further questions. Let's thank you. Okay, while Jacob is being set up, I want to introduce Jacob. Jacob is also a student from our education school who came to us to work with us in the posse, and he is also a candidate for the Master in Education, but in a different program. His program is called Higher Education Program. And Jacob got his bachelor's degree from the College of William and Mary, and also, fun fact, he was a visiting student at Hartford College of Oxford University in England.
Well, thank you.
Jacob, now we're done with the Fix-It theme. We are moving into a different data set, which is the offsite data set.
Awesome. Oh, well, thank you so much, Gerhard. And thank you, Wendy, Gerhard, and Phil for putting this on. It's lovely to be here. and actually finally be able to actually talk about all this stuff that I've been kind of talking to myself about for the past academic year. And I also say I love coming here too. I'm kind of like a hobbit, and I go from my room in Cronkite to the School of Ed, so I always love coming up here and walking up here and talking about this data. So my project is essentially on homeschool students and their career interests in STEM, and particularly the trajectory of their career interests in STEM. And so I thought I would just start out by talking about why do we even care about this kind of niche population of students, seemingly. And one way to kind of motivate this is to kind of show you in 2010 estimates of enrollment. So in 2010, we had about 1.6 million charter school students in the United States. We have about 1.4 million magnet school students in the United States. And we have about 1.7 homeschool students in the United States, from elementary to secondary education. So as you can see, even with a conservative estimate of about 1.7 million, there's some evidence to suggest that that number is actually higher, it's above 2 million. So there's actually larger than the charter school population and the magnet school population. And we have tons of research and empirical literature on charter schools, magnet schools, not so much in terms of homeschools. If you look at homeschool as a percent of the private school population, 1 out of 4 kids are homeschooled. If you just look at it in terms of the private school population. And so one of the issues in terms of the literature is we have a lot of this qualitative, some very interesting qualitative stuff, but we don't have a lot of randomized, empirically driven data that we can look at. And so the OpSci database or survey had a really cool opportunity to kind of do some interesting stuff with it. And so there's actually kind of 2 goals of this research. One is to kind of figure out, not just their career interests, because we have a glut of STEM jobs. So we have a lot of jobs that want people with STEM skills, but we don't have necessarily a lot of people with credentialed STEM skills to fill those positions. And so this raises some potentially interesting policy questions for states. And it also presents a really interesting opportunity to kind of fill in the lacunas in terms of the gaps in the research literature that's kind of going on, or to possibly confirm some findings in it. So the presentation today is really just going to be basically kind of descriptive, kind of demystifying, what this population looks like, the homeschoolers, in comparison to their public schools peers. And then also kind of giving you an idea of kind of like the baseline models for my analyses. So first thing up, in terms of gender, you can actually see females, males. Homeschools in the blue, and then I love bar charts, so there's a lot of bar charts. And then males, but there's roughly an equal distribution among the homeschool population and the public school population. In terms of race, the homeschoolers as a population in the survey are less diverse than the public school population. Oh, and I should also point out too, we got about 330 students that indicated that they had received homeschooling at some point in their high school careers, which is actually, in terms of the homeschooling literature, a very large number, even though we have 13,000 students who indicate that they received public school, which automatically presents its own kind of methodological challenges. But 330 is a really good number for the literature base. But overall, homeschool students, about 75% roughly indicate that they were white. About 60% public school students indicated that they were white. So overall, homeschool students are a little less diverse in terms of a population. Descriptive findings, really cool. So father's education level. And so you can kind of see, here's the homeschoolers. Overall, they indicate that their father, about almost a fourth of them indicate that their father had a master's degree or higher. In comparison to public school students, where almost a fourth of them indicate that their parents only received a high school a diploma or GED. And we see the same thing, the very similar findings with the mother. And this is important in terms of the homeschooling literature, because we have a lot of qualitative evidence that suggests that it's actually the maternal and not the paternal that's guiding the pedagogy and the structure of the homeschooling, and how, in some cases, it's the mother who's providing the curriculum and the teaching of the student. And so we can see, and this is an important point too, of the homeschoolers who get to introductory college classes, who get to college, their moms and their dads typically have more educational credentials than public school students. And so again, you can see that more homeschool students have bachelor's degrees, their moms do. Not too much of a difference in terms of master's degree, but overall to the trajectory is that they typically have more educational credentials. And then we can even say this is a kind of a proxy of socioeconomic status, that homeschool students are likely to have parents with possibly higher incomes than public school students. All right, and so we also kind of see some interesting things in terms of academic performance. So over here is kind of it's a conglomerate, a composite of the ACT and SAT, their overall score in the reading, language arts, and math sections. And so we can see that homeschool students, on average, have a higher mean score, or a higher score than public school students. But when you look at their math score, there's virtually very little difference between the two. So the thing that homeschoolers are outperforming their public school peers on is actually reading, language, arts. And so we don't see too much of a difference in terms of math scores, which is interesting because obviously we can make the argument that a math test score is in some way reflective of a type of skill set that you might need, or an indicator for STEM performance. So this is kind of my graph, and students indicated, self-selected and indicated, what they were interested in middle school, what they were interested in beginning and end of high school, and what they were currently interested in. And something to kind of keep in mind is that from here to here, it's 3 months. So you're going to see the summer melt that everyone talks about. It's actually, if you squeeze it together, it's actually much larger, or it's a little more, the slopes are steeper. But this is homeschoolers' interest, and so we can see the leaky pipeline here and the crazy error bars, but we can see that overall they go down. They're actually, about a third of them are pretty interested in STEM careers, so hard sciences, chemistry, biology, and engineering. And then it gradually goes down. Now here's the homeschooler, or the public school students. And so what you can see is not as interested, but as we kind of hopefully, you can almost kind of see the story is that maybe we're doing STEM programming, we're doing outreach, and they're kind of interested, and then we kind of get to the end of high school, and then we have summer melt, and then they reassess their lives or something, and we get to college, or they take their organic chemistry class, and they're like, I don't know about this anymore. But you can see overall the slope of the homeschoolers basically goes down, while the slope of the public school students almost kind of goes up. It stays possibly relatively the same. And interestingly, I didn't include this graph here. If you break this down in terms of engineering interests versus just regular hard science interests, engineering interests go up among both homeschoolers and public school students. The slope of the increase of the homeschoolers is actually lower. At the same time, the slope of the homeschoolers' interest in hard science goes down much lower too. Hence the overall lower trajectory. And so I also included this in here because there's this, not a big push, but there is a trend in higher ed for institutions to offer academic programming around pre-professional careers, so medicine, law, business. And we can see overall that it's almost kind of a reverse of the images, that public school students are on average a little more interested in these careers than their homeschoolers. And this is, let's see, do I have enough? Oh, I didn't include this graph in here, but whether this is kind of like a function of socioeconomic status is actually something I'm going to be trying to figure out, that maybe possibly because homeschoolers, their parents have more educational credentials and possibly a higher income, maybe that acts as a control and maybe pushes them towards other types of professions that they're interested in. And so I actually just got done with my first factor analysis ever. Once I figured out how to get a stata to behave, and I came up with these, there are 5 composites, and I should have included the graph on here, but basically when you look at it, homeschoolers are less interested in service-based careers, or careers that offer some type of service-based component, so helping people, working in groups. Homeschoolers are less interested in careers that have that. But they're more interested in growth-based careers, or what I call growth-based careers, where they develop their own skill set as a person, et cetera, et cetera. Homeschoolers, they're more interested in education, arts, and languages. So maybe they want to be a foreign language specialist, maybe they want to be a teacher, which is really interesting if you think about it. They go from a class size of 1, and now they want to teach their public school students. They're more interested in service-based careers, and we kind of see this also coming out with stability-based occupations that pay a high income and are fairly stable. So you're not unemployed for long periods of time and things like that. And then again, on average, public school students, and this graph kind of shows that, are a little more interested in higher paying professions than homeschoolers. And so that's it. That's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Jacob. And, oh, wow.
Oh,
You raised a lot of interesting questions.
oh boy.
So I'm curious, because it is such a small N compared to the other public school, did you look at geographic distribution of these?
I would love to.
It's
One
like-
of the posse members has this really cool, like you can do it with Google Maps, so you're gonna have to show me.
Because I know the outside data is nicely
Yeah,
distributed.
we're nationally
like,
represented.
these guys could all be in Massachusetts.
Massachusetts, right.
Somewhere.
That's an interesting point, because there's a lot of evidence that suggests the NCES just came out with a report on homeschoolers that showed that most of them are located in suburban areas or rural areas, less in urban areas. So that would be really interesting to look at, because we have the zip codes, and so we can kind of check for that.
Also, just to see if your data is
Is-
just when you were thinking about the matching, I wonder if you need
Yeah, if you have to do- Yeah. No, that's a good point.
So I'm wondering, you had mentioned that the homeschoolers seem to be less interested in engineering and the hard sciences. And I wonder if you have any data that indicates, and it is true that the majority of the homeschool teacher is the mom.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you have any data that gives any insight into the education content,
Mhm.
the profession of the homeschooling parent, and if that has any influence on whether these kids don't have the exposure to the hard sciences because of lack of ability of who's doing the homeschooling
Yeah.
education. Because I know that when a lot of these kids, from experience, get to, now we have to do physics, you're getting ready to graduate, I don't know anything about that, I need to put you back in the school or find somebody else. So I didn't know if you had any
That's an interesting question.
correlated data for that.
There might be some stuff where I can kind of get at that. I think there are some questions that ask about the coursework that the student took, but I'm not for sure if it's on there's questions about the medium, so if they took it from an online program. But you raised such an important point. There's actually 2 studies in the early 2000s, and they had a sample size of 40 homeschoolers, so kind of hard to generalize. But but one of the things they found is that the students, not SAT, but the students' standardized achievement test score, they took a test from a homeschooling company that specialized in testing homeschoolers. And so as the students' grade level increased and the parents' education level decreased, scores went down. So you raise a really interesting point, is that maybe as the mom or the dad goes into a curriculum that they don't have enough experience in, then it's like, uh-oh. And so that could be explained, why there's not a big difference in terms of the math scores. In terms of the curricular components too, there's not a lot of good data on what are the pedagogical approaches, or what are the curricular structures for homeschoolers, because they're so varied. But I would be willing to guess that there are probably more structured online components now. But in terms of how much those are incorporating STEM program is a great topic for another paper.
Yeah, I have a follow-up to that, which is, I'm just looking at the OPSI survey here, and we do ask if STEM is involved in my father's career, STEM is involved in my mother's career. So that would be a good thing to throw into the model. Very good. that may explain some of the difference.
Yeah. And what's really cool too, I didn't include this in here, is there is a scale that asks what's my home support for STEM, and so 0 to 5, and the mean average score for homeschoolers was 3.8, and I think the mean average for public school students was around 3.1, and so there was actually a pretty decent difference between the two. So they indicate more support for STEM, but the question then becomes, how are they getting that content, and how is that translating over into performance?
I'd be really interested to hear how all the trends that you showed relate to like ethnicity or gender or economic stability of the household.
Yeah, so there's not too much of a difference in terms of gender. I haven't looked at it in terms of race, but no, that's I agree. I think that would actually be quite interesting. Particularly, even the gender finding is interesting. That there's not too much of a difference between males or females. In terms of how that trajectory plays out. But race is definitely something that I think would be interesting to look at, even if you kind of composite it into kind of different categories. That's a good question. TBD.
All right, let's and for the last talk, we have a kind of change of gears because this was all about survey research. Now we're getting into experimental, educational experiments. And Jace Korhinsky is a alumnus of Phil's course on celestial navigation, and he's a recent graduate of our education school, the Masters of Education in 2017. He also has been an excellent teaching fellow in my course on Sociology in the fall semester. And so Jace will talk about an experiment that we actually did in the astrosociology class together that was done in several other settings, and that was developed by Phil Sadler. So it's a very cool thing. Please.
Great, thank you. Well, good morning. As Gerhard pointed out, yes, I'm working on this activity called Book Bits and how it pertains to teaching the nature of science. And Phil created this activity, was it 2 decades ago at this point, almost? Something like that. In response to this recurrent pattern of science concentrators and even science educators not knowing who, say, Thomas Kuhn or Karl Popper were, let alone their ideas about the nature of scientific knowledge. And I first encountered this activity last year in Phil's class and have been teaching it with Gerhardt and at the Graduate School of Education. Conversations about the nature of science have been going on with educators in this country, at least, for over 100 years. The earliest documentation I could find was from 1907, but it didn't really get the name nature of science in terms of education until about the 50s, when James Conant here at Harvard started the Harvard Cases in History of Science program, or educational curriculum. And that got developed here and then got changed and turned into, or adapted into, high school education, which was then done around the country. In the subsequent decades, there's been a lot of debate about what the nature of science is, what kind of instruments we can use to measure it, if they actually describe any kind of achievement in that realm. But it has definitely become part of the curriculum. We see the Next Generation Science Standards in 2013 actually took on the language of integrating nature of science into what students should be learning. They said, quote, students should develop an understanding of the enterprise of science as a whole, the wondering, investigating, questioning, data collecting, and analyzing. So the idea that teaching the nature of science is an important idea has definitely come into the mainstream. Questions about what the nature of science actually are and how we go about teaching it are a little more controversial. And this Book Bits activity and my research involving it are all about that teaching aspect of it. So then what exactly is this activity? Well, I should say that I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut in the 80s and 90s, which means that whenever I came to Boston, It meant that my maps didn't align with the streets, and I was constantly getting lost trying to navigate the detours due to the big dig. So as for almost 2 decades, they were digging up, I-93 and I-90, they also dug up some artifacts. And one of those artifacts is a book, or at least fragments of a book. Now, what this book is remains a mystery. What's that? Not this book. This is the best picture I could find. So what this book remains a mystery. And today, I'm hoping that with our help, with our critical thinking skills, our abilities to analyze, our creativity, and some healthy debate, that we can shed some light on this new mystery. Specifically, I'm looking for answers to the questions: what is this document about? Who was its intended audience? When and where was it written? Anyhow, that's sort of how I start the activity. And then what I do is I pass out these different fragments. I'll break the class up into groups, pass out these fragments, give them a chance to, as a group, kind of look through the material, look through the evidence, and I tell them, you have 3 minutes, say, or 5 minutes, and then after that point, if you can elect a spokesperson to then present your findings and your answers to the hypotheses, or your hypotheses based on the evidence to these questions, to the group, followed by discussion and debate. So I was thinking about doing that with everyone here, but I figured I would just kind of give you a sense of what it might look like. So this is something like what a group might get. And now I'm curious if you could just take 30 seconds to read through it. If you have any ideas, just based on this evidence, what this text might be about, just that question. Any hypotheses coming up? Yeah, please just shout it out.
History of Dome's House?
History of Dome's House.
Domiciles.
Thank you. Yes, history of housing, domiciles. Any other ideas? What might this text be about based on just these fragments that we see here? History of domiciles. No one wants to venture anything else. Is that a tacit agreement?
Construction of domiciles, not the
Architecture.
history of the construction.
Construction, okay, architecture, thank you. All right, so then what we would do is we would have people speak to that, give their evidence, and then we would debate it. And then what we would do for a next round is that we would have each group pass some of their fragments to another group. And so every group would receive new information that other groups had already seen, which might look something like this. And so then again I'd ask, take some time, study it, research, see if anything changes, present your hypotheses to the group about what this might be about, and then we would talk about it again. So now I ask, does this change anything? Does anything come up? What are your hypotheses based on this evidence?
Multiple structures there. Some tribe and what kind of dwellings they lived in over time.
Multiple structures, some tribe, and what structures they lived in over time. Okay. We would talk about this, and then I'd say, well, we have these other fragments that we thought were from another book, but through some kind of fancy carbon dating or something, we've discovered that they are necessarily part of this book. And then I would give this evidence and add it to the mix. And they would do the same thing. They would study, they would present, and then they would debate. So now, does this change anything? Does this add anything? Can we integrate this new evidence into our hypotheses?
It's more anthropological.
More anthropological. So when I would do this with groups, I started to audio record what was happening. And then I would transcribe all of this. And I started to code it based on themes. So for instance, I forget the specifics of this one, but the red might be, this is about structures. The yellow might be, this is about the history of domiciles. And then as we get on further into it, we see, well, maybe the pink is about a tribe, a specific tribe. And then we get to this kind of teal color, and maybe that's about anthropology. And so then I went back through, and I looked at all these coded sections, And I kind of categorized the different ways that people were responding to this. And I kind of bifurcated it into what I'm calling a creative or generative side, which are hypotheses, supporting evidence coming from the fragments themselves, outside evidence coming from just not the fragments, and then agreement, where there's no evidence, but they say, yeah, I think that's the case. And then on the other side, we have something that's more along the lines of challenging. So we've got refutations, falsifying evidence outside, and disagreement. And then I took this and I plotted this in time. So this is one of the activities that I did at the ed school. And I don't know if I can reach all this. And on this y-axis here, what we have are all these ideas, just like we had here, domiciles, and then maybe architecture, and then a tribe, and then anthropology. So the bottom ones are the first hypotheses to appear, and as it goes up the y-axis, that just means that they're appearing later in time. The kind of bluish colors, including the purple, are these generative ideas, hypotheses, supporting evidence, and then the reds are the refutations. And so what this shows is over a 50-minute period, exactly the conversation that was kind of starting to happen here, but along with the debate. So now what I started to do is I did this for a number of the sessions, and I started to ask, pulling from the next generation science standards and the literature on how people are defining the nature of science, well, what are these definitions, or can we turn these into questions and ask if that's happening here? So for instance, how certain and or true are scientific theories, and is the purpose of science truth or certainty? So one thing to notice is that, just like with you, I didn't provide any answers to start with. I'm not saying that there necessarily is an answer, and yet the students know, because this is a book and what they know about books, that the material has the authority. It necessarily was written. It was written at a certain time, and the author had a certain audience in mind. But they're not getting that from me. And they're not necessarily even getting that from the activity. The best that they can do is to use the evidence and use each other to come up with an idea. Do scientific theories change? Well, we see here that through this kind of iterative process of hypothesizing, supporting evidence, being challenged, that if we can maybe call this entire graph a theory, we've got the development of different ideas that are, some of them are disappearing, and new ones are kind of appearing. And that through the process of challenging, these hypotheses are changing to accommodate new information, new interpretation, and in some cases, completely new evidence. Now this is a high school 10th grade biology class. Now, some of the distinct differences are, well, there's a whole lot less refutation. There's a lot less challenge. There's also a lot less support. And so through this, I can see that they're not talking to each other, that people are presenting ideas and giving some evidence, but nobody is saying, yeah, I agree, and very few people are saying, I disagree, and especially not saying, I disagree, and this is why. So then another question is, what is the role of creativity in developing scientific knowledge? So imagining beyond the first initial hypotheses that explain things, one thing I noticed, I should have pointed this out, each of these lines represents a different round. So this was the first one, this was where we changed some of our evidence, and this is where that new evidence came in. When I look at this one, I see that the students start with the ones that they already had. In each case, they kind of posit the ideas that have already been laid out, and then they move into new territory. So in terms of thinking about the creative aspect, the ability to combine disparate ideas like buildings and bones or skeletons, can we create a model like anthropology where it seems like it has that those ideas fall into that larger category? Here's another one. This is a set of Harvard undergraduates who are doing this activity. And when I ask about so next generation science standard, what are the roles of cooperation and collaboration in the development of scientific knowledge? And here we can see how the interactions have a pretty large effect. One thing notice right away is that when there are challenges, so for instance, on that idea of that this is a large metaphor, when there are challenges that don't have supporting evidence afterwards, the hypotheses die out. We can see that in this graph too with these first ones. Simple houses, it gets challenged, there's falsifying evidence, nobody really brings it up again. In these other ones, there are challenges later on, and it kind of dies out. Whereas building it's a textbook about building, we can see that there are some challenges, but then people come up with new ideas and they adapt, and that it actually survives, as I'm saying it, and persists until the end. All right, what do we have here? Okay, so after the students do this, another really important aspect is a time for reflection, to talk about what we were doing. So I asked some simple questions. What did we do? What did you notice? Which was the best hypothesis? And what the heck does that mean? Now, I guess I'll just skip to this. Now, we got some good, some anecdotal, or students were talking about what they saw. This was one of my favorite quotes. This was on the question, what was the best hypothesis? This was a conversation between two students. So one of them is referring to somebody's theory. He had a lot of specifics in his theory. Ours were a little more general. And it's a lot easier to disprove a specific than disprove a general statement. I'm defining best as the one that's most likely to be true. And I thought it was a good theory, but there were too many leaps for my comfort. To which another student responded, I don't think it's possible to say, even if one theory is extremely specific and another is very broad, that one is more likely to be true. I think one is more easily provable or disprovable, but I don't think that has correlation with how likely it is to be right. I think that if your theory can't be disproven, it's not much of a theory. What's that? Yeah. This is an undergrad. So does the activity employ scientific thinking? I believe so, and I'm working on trying to show that. Does it provide opportunities for teachers to explicitly teach about the nature of science based on the experience of the students? I think absolutely. And then the final question that I usually get from the students, and I hold it off until the end, and I find ways to, what's that? What's the book about? Yeah. Do you want to know? Yeah. Book written originally in 1834 called The House I Live In, or The Human Body. And it actually is a giant extended metaphor about the anatomy of the human body, physiology. So what I found interesting going back to the undergrads is that they had this idea, this metaphor. You see it comes up in the second round. And there was a really kind of vicious argument in a really condensed amount of time. Because some people thought so, and the conversation that they had around this was fascinating, because they really did think that there was some kind of metaphor, but they didn't feel they had enough evidence to make that claim and to stand by it. And maybe with more time they would have, but for whatever reasons they reverted back to their original ideas because it was, they thought, the best that they could do. Anyhow, this is what I've been working on. Thank you.
And as always, please ask questions.
Melissa.
This is amazing, and I'm sorry that we were at another meeting where you missed the beginning and the other talks, but in the beginning maybe you said this. Is it just this book you've experimented with, or is there other stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's just this book so far, and just trying to figure out how to even look at these conversations and then how to represent them.
This is great, and what I was going to say is that, like, while you were showing all those graphs, that argument,
Yeah.
in Harvard undergraduates, a lot of them, right? I was like, oh, look at that, that's fascinating. And then if you think about what happens in real science, the ones that people argue about the most often turn out to be true. And so I was wondering if you had other examples, and if that turns out to be a feature of the other.
In terms of the arguments.
Well, of the arguments, or of arguments about either other rides of other work.
Sure.
That could be really interesting.
That could be. And there's a great article that I've been using, which is arguing that part of the scientific process is argument itself. And how important is it to have this one?
Yeah, I
Yes.
just wanted to say, what do you make of the fact there's very little refutation, very little argument in this 10th grade
Yes.
class?
So I have conflicted feelings. One is, so I didn't work with this class. This is my friend who's a biology teacher. And one thing that's going on with this class is that it's an extremely difficult class just to manage in terms of classroom management. So one thing I'm thinking about is in terms of bringing this to a high school level is just scaffolding this a little bit differently. So where there are worksheets that say what's your evidence, and then what are what are other people's hypotheses, and what's some counter evidence that you can come up with. And I think that might help. I also don't know how comfortable they feel arguing with each other, but they also don't seem to feel comfortable supporting each other. Like I said, there's not a single instance of someone saying, I think that's a good idea. It's for me that says more about the class, but I don't have enough data to really back that up. So this idea of the argument and the different roles that people play, how important is it to have at least someone who is holding down the side of, well, what if that's not true? Because I can see it this way. But it would be fun to do it with more books. Yeah.
I can answer it. I mean, I came up with this book after searching for a very long time. I was looking for a book that could be read at two different levels, like 1001 Arabian Nights, where it is stories about stories. And there was another book I tried, which was about a merry-go-round horse who thought he was a real horse. But this,
that one too.
Yeah, that was a little lower level, but this one was perfect because it was about science, and it could be read as this book, a textbook about structures and building and homes, or it could be read at this much higher level as a physiology book. And so I was looking for an example of the paradigm shift, where everything fits in one particular model, and then the model can be falsified and people move to a different paradigm.
Turn this into my private university. Like hundreds of classes. This is great.
Yeah.
Please.
I really love this experiment, but I'm really fascinated by why we call this the nature of science rather than the nature of scholarship in general.
Yes.
A historian would hopefully do the same. A jury hopefully would build up a picture of what had happened based on the evidence as well, and would refute. What are the characteristics that, and are they captured in this particular? They may not be.
Right. No, I think that's a great question. Part of the reason that I'm looking at it from this lens is because I'm working with the science education. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm thinking about like Talmudic history, and that's exactly what that is. And everything that I'm pointing out here would fall under that. And I think it might, I'd have to look into that more. My instinct is to say that it's maybe a subject matter question in terms of this is trying to piece together something, physical object, and so it has to do more with, say, archaeology. And there are distinctions, even in talking about the nature of science. What the literature points out is that what the nature of science is for chemistry has distinctions from that, say, of archaeology. And then what are these kind of cross things that go across disciplines? And it would be I will now start to think about it in terms of how does that even go outside of science? Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Any further questions? Well, if not, please let's thank Grace again. Our presentations of the posse, and I hope I can speak for Phil. Working with the posse is one of the more pleasant aspects of my work week.
Thanks,
and working with our members on their projects, and I hope you got a good overview of the very exciting things that go on, and if there are any people thinking about learning how to write a peer-reviewed article, how to do the nitty-gritty of science, our doors are open. Please join the posse. We need more members, and so this is the end of the official part. There should be pizza momentarily.
Yeah, I
So-
wanted to say
Oh, yeah,
a
Phil wants to
little
say
bit,
something.
which was, sorry, I was 5 minutes late. I was talking to Peggy McIntosh, who's going to speak later today and tomorrow. The posse came about because we were working with so many researchers like Zara Hazari who had graduate students in other places, and we decided we would actually try to do that here with Gerhard's urging. And what's happened over the years is that the posse members come in with their own particular interests and explore avenues that have never occurred to us. So we get first crack usually at these big data sets, and then we think that we've exhausted something, and then somebody comes to the posse and is totally new thinking and exploration. So this is a way for us as scholars, the two of us as scholars, to learn a whole lot more by benefiting from the creativity and hard work of postdocs and graduate students here at Harvard. We even have Kelly Miller, who's on the faculty at engineering school, who's done several papers with us as well. And our goal is to do research of high enough quality that we can get these published in peer-reviewed journals, and we've been very successful at that. We just got the proof this morning from John Hansen's paper of using a very sophisticated method to look at whether AP courses should get bonus letter grades and that accumulate on people's high school transcripts. The short answer is not really. And not worth what people are saying they're worth. So, but that's an old.
Can I ask you and Jason and everybody else one more question? Since
Sure.
Lisa's not here, and vaguely has to do with the AP classes. So I've been one of Nathan Sanders' friends is a AP
Right.
chemistry teacher as his wife. So anyway, I've been talking to her, and she's been talking about her students not knowing how to collaborate. And so, this is what makes me so interested in that 10th grade class. And if you think about studying for an AP test, there's not a lot of elements of collaboration, of scholarly debate and stuff like that. So I'm actually curious about two things. One is this age thing. I think that's what Mary was asking about, and then, we wish we had more data. But then there's this other question about that Roy was asking about different communities. And so I don't even think that it's necessarily the nature of the subject matter, but the nature of the field. And that, historians talk to each other in a completely different way. Just yesterday, I was at an event where an astrophysicist was giving a talk at Radcliffe, and some of the historians were going like, "Why you weren't reading anything? You didn't prepare all your words in advance." And there are these huge cultural differences, and I'm just wondering, like, there's all these cultures. There's a 10th grade classroom, there's chemistry in a 10th grade classroom, there's professional chemistry, there's history, and I'm serious. You can tell I'm kind of excited. Like, I think that you guys should do that in all of these settings. I need to learn so much about the nature of argument and also the difference between all these different fields. And so, what's your plan?
Well, I think we're, I don't know, I think we're investigating it. I mean, my motivation for that, for an activity around the nature of science, was that the national standards and all kinds of groups of college professors in the sciences have said how important the nature of science is in conveying to their students. The only problem is they never test for it. So if they don't test for it, the students aren't going to pay any attention to it. And one reason they don't test for it is they don't have any activities to do with their students. If you want to talk about the nature of science, you often have to go into the history of science, and students don't necessarily have much in the way of knowledge of the history of science. So this was a simulation of it within an hour that they could all have the same experience and then process it and then discuss it. So I wanted an activity that where there could be a paradigm shift and there could be examples of falsification. And so that was sort of the purpose here. But I don't think I don't think this is ready for prime time and implement in 10,000 classrooms
Do you guys know
nationally.
about Stuart Firestein's Ignorance Project? Do you know this? No, so Stuart Firestein is a neurobiology professor at Columbia, and he got tired of there being this 1,400-page book that says, here's what we know about neuroscience, and then he had to teach that to all the freshmen, and they get the idea that, well, if you're giving me a course, then you know a lot about the brain. And so he started explaining to them openly, the interesting parts about science are what's not in the book. You should probably know a lot of what's in this book to have interesting arguments about what's not in the book, but it's the ignorance, it's the parts of science that we totally don't understand, and know how to ask questions about what we don't understand. That's the most important part. So anyway, so he gave this TED talk about it, which is super popular, and now he teaches a course at Columbia. And now I get to choose the topic of the annual Radco Science Conference. So this conference on October 26th is called The Undiscovered. And it's about discoveries, not quite that were just serendipitous or surprising, but where people were prepared with a big baseline, and then they saw like, what? And then dark energy is the best example in astrophysics, right? So we're looking for the deceleration of the universe. Oh, we accidentally found the acceleration of the universe, right? And those 10th graders, with that kind of discussion, we're never going to get to that, right? And so stories like that, you don't want the students to get the idea like, oh, well, people always get the wrong answer. That's good, they learn everything by surprise. But the nature of like a baseline of preparation and then an open-mindedness to maybe it's not in the book or it's not in the repeat test. So anyway, there is this guy at Columbia who's really, really interested, and he's coming. He's the keynote speaker.
So there are a lot of people in this room who have taught science at the pre-college or college level, and let me, I can ask, whether you try to teach about the nature of science in some way, and whether you try to test it.
These other people, not me.
Did you?
I was trying to get through the curriculum that was laid out. Students need to know before blah, 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 but that wasn't part of what was asked. So, no.
At the museum I used to. There was no testing, obviously, it's informal, but with the teen interns I had, we did a lot of work around what science was, asking questions, how they go about answering them.
But I'm seriously worried that the way that science is taught is teaching people to not perfect. I understand that that's a very small data set, but still, it's very small. And actually, the one time that in my freshman seminar, which has no grades, the prediction lectures, if anybody, Jason and I were working together on predictions, anyway, a freshman said to me, they had to write a 2-page essay about what they thought about some philosophical thing having to do with prediction. It was just for discussion, but this freshman said to me, what's the rubric? Okay? For an ungraded 2-page essay that they were going to discuss with it, there's no pretty rubric. Just tell me what you think, right? But they've been so drilled, even a Harvard freshman, to say, how am I going to be evaluated on this? And what exactly do you want? And which box am I supposed to check off? And it's like,
that is such an important point. And what Pat's saying is what's evolved in pre-college education, K through 12, but particularly in high school, is the standards have shifted, and we've introduced high-stakes testing. So it's make or break. But what do I have to do? And it's become that teachers have to create a rubric for taking attendance, basically, for everything. And the kids have become so trained to expect a hit list of things that I need to check off to ensure that I got it all, and that it tells you I did it, and here's the level which I did it, and that's it. Unfortunately, that's become sort of the underpinnings of high school education.
You heard Jay say, well, maybe I could scaffold this a little for the 10th graders and give them a checklist of how to talk about this. I'm not saying anything against you, but I'm saying if that's necessary, this is a sad state of affairs.
It is, and much of it is driven by high-stakes testing, and you have to teach the standards, and here's what's in the standards, and history and nature science is not necessarily.
So, they come to school, they don't know something. We want them to learn the thing, but we're not going to tell them what they need to do to learn it, or like what the thing even is. Just be like, well, start talking. I hope you suddenly turn into scientists by doing it. Like, if you give them 3 years of like working over this, maybe they'll develop an academic debate. But like, we don't have 3 years for one exercise. So
3-year-old is pretty damn good at having an academic debate. So we undid that somehow in school.
Right.
That's what I'm saying.
But if you want to like do, basically, I don't like that like scorn with which you talked about a checklist to like scaffold the lesson to help them through it if this isn't something that they have practice doing. Because I mean, there's lots of stuff that we did as 3-year-olds that has fallen away completely, and that we have to relearn, and it helps to have that scaffolding.
Let's say you have no scaffolding, but I think it's better if it's not a checklist that you can do on your own, but it has to be something you do with other people.
Well, I think it was the scaffolding he was talking about, and it wasn't a rubric. It was
no, that's fine.
Questions.
I'm not against scaffolding or pieces of paper or instructions. It's just that what I see is people who can't do things without explicit instructions, and then they're constantly asking, what is it exactly that you want me to do? Like, that's what I'm hearing. So, sorry.
I just want to finish before we get the pizza, and before it gets cold. I was talking to Peggy McIntosh, who's going to give a colloquium today, and she said when she was at Harvard a long time ago, she took a biology course, and rather than having labs, the professors sent them out to 4 interesting ecological locations, like to go look at a tide pool, and with no instructions other than they had to spend an hour there looking. And it was sort of the opposite of learning about all the theory and what all the experts say, and then going to look at something or going into the lab. And she said it was very memorable to look at these 4 systems and just observe before having the expert talk about it. So this is an experience, what Jason was doing was an experience that people have before they have the Kuhnian or Tartarian views presented. So I think that's one of the values. And now we have our pizza. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Good job. Good job. There's a lot of people. Thanks, I'm looking at these big error bars. What are we going to do with the big error bars? They're too big. Now, one of the ways is to perhaps use dominance of your linear function. A couple of ways. I like the idea of building